When, however, M. de Guise and M. de Tronwy found themselves pressed in this way, they ordered their 200 men-at-arms to turn right about face, while at the opposite end, that is, at the head of the army, Maréchal de Guise and Trevulles ordered a halt and lances in rest. Meanwhile, according to custom, the king, who, as we said, was in the centre, was conferring knighthood on those gentlemen who had earned the favour either by virtue of their personal powers or the king's special friendship. Suddenly there was heard a terrible clash behind. It was the French rearguard coming to blows with the Marquis of Mantua. Where each man had singled out his own foe as though it were a tournament, very many lances were broken, especially those of the Italian knights, for their lances were hollowed so as to be less heavy, and in consequence had less solidity. Those who were thus disarmed at once seized their swords. As they were far more numerous than the French, the king saw them suddenly outflanking his right wing, and apparently prepared to surround it. At the same moment loud cries were heard from a direction facing the centre. This meant that the Stradiotes were crossing the river to make their attack. The king at once ordered his division into 2 detachments, and giving one to Bourbon the Bastard, to make head against the Stradiotes, he hurried with the second to the rescue of the van, flinging himself into the very midst of the melee, striking out like a king, and doing as steady work as the lowest in rank of his captains. Aided by the reinforcement, the rearguard made a good stand, though the enemy were 5 against 1, and the combat in this part continued to rage with wonderful fury. Obeying his orders, Bourbon had thrown himself upon the Stradiotes, but unfortunately, carried off by his horse, he had penetrated so far into the enemy's ranks that he was lost to sight. The disappearance of their chief, the strange dress of their new antagonists, and the peculiar method of their fighting produced a considerable effect on those who were to attack them, and for the moment disorder was the consequence in the centre, and the horsemen scattered instead of serrying their ranks and fighting in a body. This false move would have done them serious harm, had not most of the Stradiotes, seeing the baggage alone and undefended, rushed after that in hope of booty, instead of following up their advantage. A great part of the troop nevertheless stayed behind to fight, pressing on the French cavalry and smashing their lances with fearful scimitars. Happily the king, who had just repulsed the Marquis of Mantua's attack, perceived what was going on behind him, and riding back at all possible speed to the succour of the centre, together with the gentlemen of his household, fell upon the Stradiotes, no longer armed with a lance, for that he had just broken, but brandishing his long sword, which blazed about him like lightning, and, either because he was whirled away like Bourbon by his own horse, or because he had allowed his courage to take him too far, he suddenly found himself in the thickest ranks of the Stradiotes, accompanied only by 8 of the knights he had just now created, one equerry called Antoine de Zamboul, and his standard-bearer. "France! France!" he cried aloud, to rally round him all the others who had scattered. They, seeing at last the danger was less than they had supposed, began to take their revenge and to pay back with interest the blows they had received from the Stradiotes. Things were going still better for the van which the Marquis de Cajazzo was to attack, for although he had at first appeared to be animated with a terrible purpose, he stopped short about 10 or 12 feet from the French line, and turned right about face without breaking a single lance. The French wanted to pursue, but the Maréchal de Guise, fearing that this fight might be only a trick to draw off the vanguard from the centre, ordered every man to stay in his place. But the Swiss, who were German, and did not understand the order, or thought it was not meant for them, followed upon their heels, and although on foot, caught them up and killed 100 of them. This was quite enough to throw them into disorder, so that some were scattered about the plain, and others made a rush for the water, so as to cross the river and rejoin their camp. When the Maréchal de Guise saw this, he detached 100 of his own men to go to the aid of the king, who was continuing to fight with unheard-of courage, and running the greatest risks, constantly separated as he was from his gentlemen, who could not follow him, for wherever there was danger, thither he rushed with his cry of "France!" little troubling himself as to whether he was followed or not. And it was no longer with his sword that he fought, that he had long ago broken, like his lance, but with a heavy battle-axe, whose every blow was mortal whether cut or pierced. Thus the Stradiotes, already hard pressed by the king's household and his pensioners, soon changed attack for defence, and defence for flight. It was at this moment that the king was really in the greatest danger, for he had let himself be carried away in pursuit of the fugitives, and presently found himself all alone, surrounded by these men, who, had they not been struck with a mighty terror, would have had nothing to do but unite and crush him and his horse together. But, as Commynes remarks, "He whom God guards is well guarded," and God was guarding the King of France. All the same, at this moment the French were sorely pressed in the rear, and although de Guise and de la Tremouille held out as firmly as it was possible to hold, they would probably have been compelled to yield to superior numbers had not a double aid arrived in time. First the indefatigable Charles, who, having nothing more to do amongst the fugitives, once again dashed into the midst of the fight. Next the servants of the army, who, now that they were set free from the Stradiotes and saw their enemies put to flight, ran up armed with the axes they habitually used to cut down wood for building their huts. They burst into the middle of the fray, slashing at the horses' legs and dealing heavy blows that smashed in the visors of the dismounted horsemen. The Italians could not hold out against this double attack. The Furia Francese rendered all their strategy and all their calculations useless, especially as for more than a century they had abandoned their fights of blood and fury for a kind of tournament they chose to regard as warfare. So, in spite of all Gonzaga's efforts, they turned their backs upon the French rear and took to flight. In the greatest haste and with much difficulty they recrossed the torrent, which was swollen even more now by the rain that had been falling during the whole time of the battle. Some thought fit to pursue the vanquished, for there was now such disorder in their ranks that they were fleeing in all directions from the battlefield where the French had gained so glorious a victory, blocking up the roads to Parma and Bercetto. But Maréchal de Guise and de Tremouille, who had done quite enough to save them from the suspicion of quailing before imaginary dangers, put a stop to this enthusiasm, by pointing out that it would only be risking the loss of their present advantage if they tried to push it farther with men and horses so worn out. This view was adopted in spite of the opinion of Trevulles, Camillo Vitelli, and Francesco Secco, who were all eager to follow up the victory. The king retired to a little village on the left bank of the Taro, and took shelter in a poor house. There he disarmed, being perhaps among all the captains and all the soldiers the man who had fought best. During the night the torrent swelled so high the Italian army could not have pursued, even if they had laid aside their fears. The king did not propose to give the appearance of fight after a victory, and therefore kept his army drawn up all day, and at night went on to sleep at Medesano, a little village only a mile lower down than the hamlet where he rested after the fight. But in the course of the night he reflected that he had done enough for the honour of his arms in fighting an army 4 times as great as his own, and killing 3,000 men, and then waiting a day and a half to give them time to take their revenge. So 2 hours before daybreak he had the fires lighted, that the enemy might suppose he was remaining in camp, and every man mounting noiselessly, the whole French army, almost out of danger by this time, proceeded on their march to Borgo San Donnino. While this was going on, the Pope returned to Rome, where news highly favourable to his schemes was not slow to reach his ears. He learned that Ferdinand had crossed from Sicily into Calabria with 6,000 volunteers and a considerable number of Spanish horse and foot, led, at the command of Ferdinand and Isabella, by the famous Gonzaga de Cordova, who arrived in Italy with a great reputation, destined to suffer somewhat from the defeat at Seminara. At almost the same time the French fleet had been beaten by the Aragonese. Moreover, the battle of the Taro, though a complete defeat for the Confederates, was another victory for the Pope, because its result was to open a return to France for that man whom he regarded as his deadliest foe. So, feeling that he had nothing more to fear from Charles, he sent him a brief at Turin, where he had stopped for a short time to give aid to Novara, therein commanding him, by virtue of his pontifical authority, to depart out of Italy with his army, and to recall within 10 days those of his troops that still remained in the kingdom of Naples, on pain of excommunication, and a summons to appear before him in person. Charles VIII replied, 1. That he did not understand how the Pope, the chief of the League, ordered him to leave Italy, whereas the Confederates had not only refused him a passage, but had even attempted, though unsuccessfully, as perhaps his Holiness knew, to cut off his return into France. 2. That as to recalling his troops from Naples, he was not so irreligious as to do that, since they had not entered the kingdom without the consent and blessing of his Holiness. 3. that he was exceedingly surprised that the Pope should require his presence in person at the capital of the Christian world just at the present time, when 6 weeks previously, at the time of his return from Naples, although he ardently desired an interview with his Holiness, that he might offer proofs of his respect and obedience, his Holiness, instead of according this favour, had quitted Rome so hastily on his approach that he had not been able to come up with him by any efforts whatsoever. On this point, however, he promised to give his Holiness the satisfaction he desired, if he would engage this time to wait for him. He would therefore return to Rome as soon as the affairs that brought him back to his own kingdom had been satisfactorily settled. Although in this reply there was a touch of mockery and defiance, Charles was none the less compelled by the circumstances of the case to obey the Pope's strange brief. His presence was so much needed in France that, in spite of the arrival of a Swiss reinforcement, he was compelled to conclude a peace with Lodovico Sforza, whereby he yielded Novara to him, while Gilbert de Montpensier and d'Aubigny, after defending, inch by inch, Calabria, the Basilicate, and Naples, were obliged to sign the capitulation of Atella after a siege of 32 days, on the 20th of July, 1496. This involved giving back to Ferdinand II, King of Naples, all the palaces and fortresses of his kingdom, which indeed he did but enjoy for 3 months, dying of exhaustion on the 7th of September following, at the Castello della Somma, at the foot of Vesuvius. All the attentions lavished upon him by his young wife could not repair the evil that her beauty had wrought. His uncle Frederick succeeded, and so, in the 3 years of his papacy, Alexander VI had seen 5 kings upon the throne of Naples, while he was establishing himself more firmly upon his own pontifical seat: Ferdinand I, Alfonso I, Charles VIII, Ferdinand II, and Frederick. All this agitation about his throne, the rapid succession of sovereigns, was the best thing possible for Alexander, for each new monarch became actually king only on condition of his receiving the pontifical investiture. The consequence was that Alexander was the only gainer in power and credit by these changes, for the Duke of Milan and the republics of Florence and Venice had successively recognized him as supreme head of the Church, in spite of his simony. Moreover, the 5 kings of Naples had in turn paid him homage. So he thought the time had now come for founding a mighty family, and for this he relied upon the Duke of Gandia, who was to hold all the highest temporal dignities, and upon Caesar Borgia, who was to be appointed to all the great ecclesiastical offices. The Pope made sure of the success of these new projects by electing 4 Spanish cardinals, who brought up the number of his compatriots in the Sacred College to 22, thus assuring him a constant and certain majority. The first requirement of the Pope's policy was to clear away from the neighbourhood of Rome all those petty lords whom most people call vicars of the Church, but whom Alexander called the shackles of the Papacy. We saw that he had already begun this work by rousing the Orsini against the Colonna family, when Charles VIII enterprise compelled him to concentrate all his mental resources, and also all the forces of his state, so as to secure his own personal safety. It had come about through their own imprudent action that the Orsini, the Pope's old friends, were now in the pay of the French, and had entered the kingdom of Naples with them, where one of them, Virginio, a very important member of their powerful house, had been taken prisoner during the war, and was Ferdinand II's captive. Alexander could not let this opportunity escape him, so, first ordering the King of Naples not to release a man who, ever since the 1st of June 1496, had been a declared rebel, he pronounced a sentence of confiscation against Virginio Orsini and his whole family in a secret consistory, which sat on the 26th of October following, that is to say, in the early days of the reign of Frederick, whom he knew to be entirely at his command, owing to the king's great desire of getting the investiture from them. Then, as it was not enough to declare the goods confiscated without also dispossessing the owners, he made overtures to the Colonna family, saying he would commission them, in proof of their new bond of friendship, to execute the order given against their old enemies under the direction of his son Francesco, Duke of Gandia. In this fashion he contrived to weaken his neighbours each by means of the other, till such time as he could safely attack and put an end to conquered and conqueror alike. The Colonna family accepted this proposition, and the Duke of Gandia was named General of the Church. His father in his pontifical robes bestowed on him the insignia of this office in the Church of St. Peter's at Rome.